In 1848, a woman named Tamsin Donner packed 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon, and enough dried apples to fill a barrel for a journey she would never finish. Most frontier wives did the same. They loaded wagons with food they prayed would last 6 months across 1,000 miles of nothing. Number 14 on this list was learned directly from Native American women and kept entire wagon trains alive through winter. And number 3 sounds like something you would throw in the trash today, but it was the single most calorie-dense survival food ever created on this continent. These 25 foods were not cooked for pleasure. They were cooked because the alternative was starvation. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what these women pulled off in cast iron and campfire smoke puts every modern kitchen to shame. Let us count them down. Number 25, hardtack. Every frontier woman knew how to make the cracker that could outlive her. Flour, water, a pinch of salt, mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, punched with holes from a fork, and baked until it turned into something closer to a roofing tile than a biscuit. Pioneers called them molar breakers. Soldiers called them sheet iron. Children called them nothing printable. But hardtack could last years without spoiling. And on the Oregon Trail, that mattered more than taste. A woman would bake dozens before the journey west, stack them into barrels, and ration them across months. You could not eat them dry without risking a cracked tooth. The trick was dunking them in coffee until they softened into something your jaw could handle, or crumbling them into whatever stew the evening fire produced. They tasted like salted cardboard. But when the flour ran low and the next trading post was 200 miles east, hardtack kept your family breathing. No frontier pantry was without them. Number 24, salt pork and nothing else. Before bacon became a breakfast luxury, salt pork was the backbone of westward expansion. Fatty slabs of pork belly were packed in barrels of heavy brine, sometimes so salty the meat had to soak in fresh water for hours before anyone could stomach it. A single barrel weighed over 200 pounds. Frontier women fried slices in cast iron skillets every morning, the grease popping and hissing over the open flame. That same grease went into biscuits, beans, and anything else that needed fat. Children ate salt pork for breakfast, lunch, and supper. The monotony was crushing. One trail diary from 1852 recorded simply, "Pork again." The children did not complain. They have forgotten what else there is. Harriet Martineau, traveling through the frontier, wrote that you could find little else than pork under all manner of disguises. Salt pork was not a meal, it was a sentence, but it kept families marching west. Number 23, cornmeal mush. Morning, noon, and night, cornmeal mush showed up at frontier tables with the persistence of a debt collector. Boiled cornmeal and water. That was the whole recipe. Frontier women stirred it over the fire until it thickened into a gray, lumpy porridge that stuck to the spoon and sat in the stomach like wet cement. If the family had a milk cow still producing, a splash of milk went on top. If they had molasses, a drizzle of sweetness made it bearable. Most days there was neither. The leftover mush from breakfast was poured into a pan, left to set until it firmed into a solid block, then sliced and fried in pork fat for supper. Same ingredients, different texture, still miserable. Corn was the one crop that grew almost anywhere and forgave bad soil, so cornmeal became the default fuel of the American frontier. Women packed sacks of it weighing 50 pounds or more per person. The taste was bland, the nutrition was barely adequate, but it filled bellies when nothing else could. Number 22, vinegar pie. When a frontier woman craved something sweet and there was no fruit within 100 miles, she made pie out of vinegar. Apple cider vinegar mixed with water, sugar if she had it, flour, eggs, and whatever spice the pantry could spare. The acid in the vinegar mimicked the tartness of lemon or apple, creating a custard that looked almost normal in a pie shell. It was not delicious, but it was pie. And on the prairie, pie meant civilization had not completely abandoned you. Women served it after weeks of nothing but beans and salt pork, and children ate it like it was the finest thing they had ever tasted. Because compared to mush and hardtack, it was. Cookbooks from the 1870s listed vinegar pie alongside proper fruit pies without apology. It was not a substitute. It was survival dressed in pastry. Number 21. Dried apples. Everything. Every wagon heading west carried bags of dried apples, leathery brown rings strung on cord or packed loose in cotton sacks. Women soaked them overnight, stewed them into sauce, stuffed them into dumplings, or baked them into pies that approximated something from back east. Dried apples lasted months without spoiling and weighed almost nothing compared to fresh fruit. But after 3 months on the trail, the sight of another dried apple could make a grown woman weep. Trail songs mocked them. One popular verse went, "I loathe, abhor, detest, despise, abominate dried apple pies." Still, those leathery rings prevented scurvy when nothing green grew for miles. Frontier women learned to rehydrate them slowly, adding cinnamon bark when they had it, brown sugar when they did not. The result was never going to win a county fair, but it kept teeth from falling out and children from crying. And on the frontier, that counted as a triumph. Number 20. Son of a gun stew. This was the meal nobody talked about in polite company. When a calf was butchered on the trail or the ranch, nothing was wasted. Heart, liver, tongue, kidneys, sweetbreads, marrow gut, and brains all went into the pot. Frontier women simmered the whole mess for hours over a low flame, seasoning with whatever they had: salt, pepper, wild onion if the ground offered any. The stew was thick, dark, and rich with a mineral tang that modern stomachs would rebel against. Cowboys called it son of a gun stew because the original name was unprintable. The dish had roots in Mexican vaquero cooking, where menudo, a tripe stew, was standard fare. Frontier women adapted it because wasting a single organ meant wasting calories your family could not afford to lose. The taste was an acquired thing. The nutrition was undeniable. Number 19. Buffalo chip fuel cooking. Here is where things get uncomfortable. On the Great Plains, there were no trees. No wood meant no fire. No fire meant no food. So frontier women burned dried buffalo dung. They called them buffalo chips, and gathering them was a daily chore that fell to women and children. Ada McCall was photographed in 1893 on the Kansas prairie, apron full of chips, heading back to cook supper. The chips burned hot and surprisingly clean, producing a steady heat that could bake biscuits in a Dutch oven or simmer a pot of beans. Women who had come from timbered states in the East were horrified at first. Diaries record the shame, but necessity killed embarrassment fast. A rule of thumb said a family needed a fuel pile as big as their cabin to cook and heat through winter. Buffalo chips were free, abundant, and kept families alive when the prairie offered nothing else to burn. Number 18. Jackrabbit roasted over an open fire. Jackrabbits were everywhere on the plains, and when the pork ran out and the beef was months away, frontier women trapped and roasted them whole. The meat was lean to the point of dryness, stringy and tough compared to domestic rabbit, and gamey enough to turn away anyone who was not genuinely hungry. But a large jackrabbit could feed 2 adults, and a woman with a rifle or a snare could catch several in a day. She would gut and skin the animal, skewer it on a green stick, and rotate it slowly over coals until the meat pulled from the bone. Fat was the problem. Jackrabbit had almost none, which meant the body could not process the protein efficiently without adding lard or butter. Frontier women learned this the hard way. Some families who ate nothing but lean rabbit for weeks developed what trappers called rabbit starvation, a condition where the body wastes away despite a full stomach. The fix was simple: cook it in pork drippings. Problem solved. First pattern break. The Dutch oven changed everything. That heavy, lidded cast iron pot was the single most important piece of kitchen equipment on the American frontier. A woman could bake bread, roast meat, simmer stew, and fry bacon all in one vessel. She would nestle it into a bed of coals, heap more coals on the lid, and the radiant heat cooked from every direction. Biscuits came out golden, roasts came out tender, beans came out soft after hours of slow heat. Trail guides from the 1850s listed the Dutch oven as essential equipment, more important than extra clothing or tools. Women who lost their Dutch ovens to river crossings or broken axles described it like losing a limb. One diary entry from 1853 reads, "The Dutch oven fell into the Platte. I sat on the bank and cried. There is no replacing it. A good Dutch oven cost about $2 and lasted a lifetime. Some were passed down through 3 generations. No other tool fed more families across more miles of hostile ground." Number 16. Squirrel stew. Squirrels were the fast food of the frontier. Small, abundant, and available year-round, they became the protein source women relied on when larger game was scarce. The problem was the bullet. Most frontier rifles were large-caliber weapons that would obliterate a squirrel on impact. So hunters learned a technique called barking, shooting the bark beneath the squirrel to knock it from the tree without shredding the meat. Women would skin and joint the animals, simmer them in water with wild onion and root vegetables, and stretch a single squirrel into enough stew for a small child. Several squirrels made a family meal. The Housekeeping and Old Virginia cookbook from the 1870s listed barbecue squirrel alongside recipes for calf head soup and baked sheep head as standard frontier fare. The meat was lean, slightly sweet, and tender when cooked long and slow. Children who grew up on it never forgot the taste. Number 15. Beans. Just beans. Forever beans. Pinto beans, navy beans. Whatever dried beans could be loaded into a sack and thrown into the wagon. Frontier women soaked them overnight, boiled them for hours, seasoned them with salt pork or bacon grease, and served them at every single meal until the family begged for mercy. Beans were the most reliable calorie source on the trail. They were cheap, light when dried, and practically immortal in storage. A pound of dried beans could feed a family of 4 for a day. Women cooked them in the Dutch oven, in kettles hung over campfires, and in iron pots buried in coals overnight for the slow-baked version that became a Saturday night tradition across the West. The flatulence was legendary, the nutrition was undeniable, and the monotony was soul-crushing. But beans kept more families alive on the frontier than any other single food. They were not exciting, they were essential. Number 14. Pemmican. This was the food frontier women learned from Native American women, and it was arguably the greatest survival food ever created on this continent. Dried meat, usually buffalo or venison, was pounded into a fine powder between stones. Rendered fat, called tallow, was melted and poured over the meat. Dried berries, often chokecherries or service berries, were mixed in for flavor and vitamins. The whole mass was pressed into rawhide bags or rolled into dense bars. Pemmican could last for years. It was calorie-dense enough that a small portion could fuel a full day of hard labor. Lewis and Clark carried it. Mountain men survived winters on it. Frontier women who learned the technique from indigenous neighbors passed it down as the most valuable recipe they owned. The taste was something like very dry beef jerky, coated in tallow. Not pleasant by modern standards, but when you were snowbound in a cabin in Montana territory with nothing else, it tasted like salvation. Number 13. Sourdough biscuits from a living starter. Every serious frontier woman kept a sourdough starter alive, like it was a member of the family. A paste of flour and water, colonized by wild yeast kept in a crock, fed daily, and carried in wagons wrapped in blankets to keep it warm. That starter was the only leavening agent many families had for months at a stretch. Commercial yeast did not exist on the prairie. If the starter died, bread died with it. Women would pull a cup of starter, mix it with flour, salt, and a bit of lard, and bake biscuits in the Dutch oven every morning. The biscuits were tangy, dense, and chewy, nothing like the fluffy buttermilk biscuits of the South. But they were real bread, and real bread meant morale. The measure of a good frontier cook was how good her biscuits were. Some starters were kept alive for decades, carried from Missouri to Oregon to California, surviving river crossings, blizzards, and the death of the women who made them. Number 12. Fried rattlesnake. In the desert. Southwest, rattlesnakes were not just a hazard, they were dinner. Frontier women who settled in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico learned to kill, skin, and cook them out of pure necessity. The meat was white, firm, and mild, tasting somewhere between chicken and fish. A large rattlesnake could provide enough meat for 2 adults. Women would gut the snake, strip the skin, cut the body into sections, dredge them in cornmeal, and fry them in pork fat until golden. Children ate it without knowing what it was, and mothers kept the secret as long as possible. The venom was in the head, which was buried immediately. The rest of the animal was safe to handle and cook. Rattlesnake was never a first choice, but when the pantry was empty and something with meat on its bones crossed your path, you did not ask questions. You lit the fire. Second pattern, break. The wagon pantry was its own invention. Frontier women organized their rolling kitchens with a precision that would shame most modern meal preppers. Flour went in barrels at the bottom of the wagon, insulated from heat. Eggs were packed in barrels of cornmeal to prevent breakage. Bacon was wrapped in bran to slow the fat from melting in summer heat. Glass canning jars filled with preserves were nested inside flour barrels, where the temperature stayed even. Coffee beans were kept whole and ground fresh each morning. Hanging beneath the wagon, a covered bucket of milk from the morning milking would churn itself into butter by evening. The rocking of the unsprung axle did the work. Women who packed poorly died. Women who packed well arrived. Number 10. Prairie turnips. Native women taught settler women to dig these starchy wild roots from the plains, and for many families they were the only fresh vegetable available for months. Prairie turnips grew wild across the Great Plains, their lavender flowers marking the spot where a thick, potato-like root waited underground. Women dug them with sharpened sticks, peeled the tough skin, and boiled or roasted them alongside whatever meat the day offered. The taste was starchy and mild, closer to a water chestnut than a domestic turnip. Dried and pounded into flour, they could be stored for winter and added to stews as a thickener. Without this knowledge, passed freely between indigenous and settler women, many families would have faced scurvy, or worse during the long months between harvests. Number 9. Bear meat and bear grease. When a frontier family brought down a bear, nothing was wasted. Women rendered the fat into grease that served as butter, cooking oil, leather conditioner, and even hair pomade. Bear grease was the all-purpose fat of the Mountain West, prized for its high smoke point and neutral flavor when properly rendered. The meat itself was rich, dark, and dangerously variable. A bear that had been eating berries tasted sweet and tender. A bear that had been eating fish tasted like the river bottom. Women learned to judge the animal's diet by the color of the fat. Pale meant good eating, yellow meant brace yourself. Jim Bridger, the famous mountain man, swore cougar was the finest meat in the West, but most frontier women preferred bear for its fat content alone. That grease kept families fed when nothing else would fry. Number 8. Choke cherry jam and syrup. Choke cherries grew wild across the frontier in dense thickets that produced clusters of small, dark, astringent fruit that puckered the mouth and stained the fingers purple. Eaten raw, they were barely tolerable, but frontier women transformed them. They boiled the berries with sugar or honey, strained out the pits, and cooked the juice down into a thick jam or syrup that went on biscuits, pancakes, and bread for months. When wagon trains stopped for layovers, women like Rebecca Ridgely spent the downtime putting up jars of choke cherry preserves, using glass canning jars packed in flour barrels for safe transport. That purple jam was one of the few sweet things available between Missouri and Oregon. It provided vitamin C that prevented scurvy and a taste of something besides salt and grease. Children fought over the last spoonful. Mothers rationed it with the seriousness of medicine, because on the frontier, sweetness was medicine. Number 7. Calf's foot jelly. Calf's foot jelly, digestible. Healing food. This one sounds medieval, but it was standard frontier medicine and food combined. Women boiled calves' feet for hours until the collagen dissolved into the water, then strained the liquid and let it cool into a trembling, clear jelly. Flavored with a little sugar and whatever spice was on hand, it was fed to the sick, the elderly, and to children recovering from fever. The gelatin was easy to digest and provided protein when solid food could not be tolerated. Virginia cookbooks from the 1870s listed it alongside recipes that seem alien now. Calf brain pudding, lamb brain fricassee, baked sheephead. But calf's foot jelly survived longest because it genuinely worked. Women carried the knowledge west and used it when doctors were 100 miles away, and the nearest apothecary was only a memory. Number 6. Roasted skunk. Frontier survival guides were explicit. Remove the scent glands first, carefully, or the meat is ruined. After that, the animal was gutted, skinned, and roasted over coals like any other small game. The meat was dark, rich, and fatty, more flavorful than rabbit, and with enough fat to actually sustain a body through hard work. Women who cooked skunk did not advertise it. Diaries mention it in passing, with a tone closer to confession than recipe sharing. Skunks were abundant across every habitat in the West, from woodlands to desert, and when the choice was skunk or starvation, pride made poor company. Families ate what the land offered. The land offered skunk. Number 5. Switchel. On blistering summer days when the dust choked every breath and water alone could not keep a body working, frontier women mixed switchel. Water, vinegar, molasses, or honey, and ground ginger were stirred together and served cool if possible, lukewarm if not. It was the original sports drink, replacing minerals lost to sweat and calming stomachs irritated by dust and bad water. The ginger settled nausea. The vinegar aided digestion. The molasses provided quick energy. Women brewed it by the gallon during harvest and cattle drives, handing out cups to anyone working in the heat. It tasted sharp, sweet, and spicy all at once. Not refreshing exactly, but effective. The recipe traveled west from New England farming communities where it had been used for generations. On the frontier, it became essential. Water alone was not enough when you were building a homestead by hand under a sun that never quit. Number 4. Head cheese came from whatever head was available. When a hog or a bear was butchered, the head went into the pot. Women simmered it for hours until every scrap of meat fell from the skull, then picked through the mass, discarding bone and gristle and seasoning the shredded meat with salt, pepper, and vinegar. The cooking liquid, thick with natural gelatin, was poured over the meat in a mold and left to set into a dense, sliceable loaf. Head cheese was served cold, sliced thin, sometimes with mustard, sometimes with nothing but gratitude. It used every edible scrap from an animal that had cost the family dearly to raise or hunt. Wasting the head was unthinkable. The result was rich, porky, and deeply savory, with a texture that made children suspicious, but kept adults fed through the lean months between butchering seasons. It lasted for weeks in cold weather and stretched a single animal further than any other preparation. Third pattern break. Coffee was survival, and when real coffee ran out, frontier women got desperate and creative. They roasted sweet potatoes, dried them, ground them into a powder, and brewed that. They did the same with acorns, parching and grinding them into a bitter, earthy substitute. Chicory woney root was the most popular stand-in, producing a dark, slightly sweet brew that approximated real coffee if you squinted hard enough. Some women mixed all three together and called it good enough. Coffee was not a luxury on the frontier. It was the drug that kept families functional through 16-hour workdays in hostile territory. The ritual of boiling coffee over the morning fire was the one piece of normalcy women clung to when everything else had been stripped away. Losing coffee meant losing morale, and losing morale on the frontier meant losing everything. Number 2. Prickly pear cactus pads. In the Southwest, Mexican settlers taught frontier women to harvest the flat green pads of the prickly pear cactus, burn off the spines, dice the flesh, and scramble it with eggs, or simmer it into stews. The pads, called nopalitos, had a mild, slightly slimy texture similar to okra, and they were rich in vitamin C. Women who learned this technique could feed their families fresh vegetables year-round, in a landscape where nothing else green survived the heat. The preparation was careful work. Miss a single spine and your dinner would make you bleed. But the reward was a genuine vegetable, something most frontier families went months without tasting. Prickly pear fruit, the bright red bulbs that grew from the edges of the pads, could be mashed into a sweet syrup or eaten raw after the tiny hair-like spines were burned away. The cactus fed families that the prairie tried to starve. And number 1, the desperation meal, boiled rawhide. When everything else was gone, when the flour barrel was empty and the game had vanished and the trading post was buried under snow, frontier women boiled the rawhide lashings from their own wagons and equipment. They cut strips of untanned animal hide, simmered them for hours until the collagen broke down into a thick, gelatinous broth, and served it to their children. It had almost no flavor. It had barely any nutrition, but it kept the stomach from collapsing on itself and bought one more day of survival. Trail journals record families eating rawhide, saddle leather, and the glue from book bindings during the worst crossings. The Donner Party's final weeks are the most famous example, but they were not alone. Dozens of wagon trains faced the same calculus, and it was always the women who found a way to turn the inedible into something that kept breathing going for one more night. Boiled rawhide was not food, it was refusal. Refusal to die. Refusal to let your children die. And that refusal, that brutal, stubborn will to survive, is what built the American West. These 25 foods were not recipes. They were acts of war against starvation, distance, and a landscape that offered nothing for free. Frontier women did not cook for pleasure. They cooked to keep their families alive. Try telling that to anyone who complains about what is in their refrigerator. Share which one shocked you most in the comments. And if your great-grandmother had a frontier recipe that survived the generations, I want to hear it.